Before we get into this, quick moment of honesty. If you're here, it means you don't just want headlines, you want context. You want the why, not just the what. And that's exactly what this channel is built for. So if you appreciate calm breakdowns instead of screaming thumbnails, hit the like button. It helps this kind of content reach people who actually care about facts. And if you want more deep dives where we slow things down and let the story speak for itself, subscribe. No drama farming, no rumor pushing, just analysis. All right, let's get into it. Why this story feels different. The room is already quiet, but the silence isn't empty. It's the kind of pause that tells you something wasn't planned. The camera is rolling, the audience is waiting, and for a brief moment, even the speaker seems unsure how to begin. That hesitation matters because when the words finally come, they don't land like gossip. They land like regret. Funky doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't joke. He doesn't perform. Instead, he says something that immediately reframes everything that follows. He never wanted this to happen, and he's not proud of it. That single admission shifts the atmosphere, because this doesn't feel like someone chasing attention. It feels like someone correcting a record that's already hardened in the public mind. And then he says the line that detonates the internet. He calls Tamar a bold-faced liar. Within minutes, clips spread. Comment sections explode. People rewind, replay, dissect tone and timing. But beneath the noise, a more unsettling question begins to surface, one that hasn't gone away since. If the story that was told publicly isn't accurate, then what actually happened that night? And more importantly, who paid the price for the way it was framed? The moment the narrative fractured, Funky makes something clear almost immediately. This was never supposed to become public spectacle. He says he didn't ask to be part of whatever this turned into. He didn't volunteer to be analyzed, accused, or folded into internet theories. What pushed him to speak wasn't curiosity, it was frustration. Specifically, frustration with how the story was told. According to Funky, the issue isn't that Tamar spoke publicly. It's how she spoke. The framing, the implication, the way uncertainty was presented as something close to fact, close enough that the internet could fill in the gaps without resistance. And the internet always fills the gaps. What bothers Funky most is the suggestion that Tamar didn't know what happened to her, that the night was presented as a blur. Confusion wrapped in vulnerability, a story shaped around not knowing, not being aware. Funky doesn't challenge her emotions, he challenges the logic. Because in his telling, this wasn't a chaotic, uncontrollable night. It was a sequence of decisions, plans made, locations changed, calls exchanged, directions adjusted. Nothing about it suggests a loss of awareness, at least not at the start. And that's where the tension sharpens. Because once a story is framed as confusion, the audience starts searching for causes. And when causes aren't named, people become suspects. Funky insists that's exactly what happened. Reconstructing the beginning. He walks through the early part of the night carefully, almost clinically. They were looking for food. Places were closed. They were deciding where to go. Eventually, they settled on Roof Chris. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming. His tone here is intentional, ordinary, even boring. And that's the point. Because ordinary doesn't align with the later narrative of near catastrophe. When Funky references Tamar later saying she woke up in a pool of blood and almost died, he doesn't mock it. He contrasts it. He points out that in other retellings, she was home. Someone suggested calling an ambulance, but no emergency response followed. That contradiction matters, not because it proves anything, but because inconsistency creates confusion powerful enough to swallow everyone around it. And once confusion hits social media, it doesn't stay contained. The group dynamics shift. This is where Funky's tone changes again, subtly, but noticeably. He brings up the concept of group dynamics, not once, not twice, repeatedly. That repetition signals discomfort. According to Funky, this wasn't the first time he noticed something off. He references earlier moments, public settings, music video environments, restaurants, where proximity between Tamar and Mendeecees felt increasingly normalized. Not secretive, public. Sitting close, sitting on laps, kissing in shared spaces. Funky doesn't accuse. He doesn't speculate about motives. He simply describes what he saw and how it made him feel. Uncomfortable. And that discomfort is critical because it reframes what happens next. Why he didn't go upstairs. When they returned to Tamar's house, Funky made a deliberate choice. He didn't go upstairs. Not because he was tired, not because he didn't care, but because, in his words, the dynamic between Tamar and Mendeecees had already crossed into something that made him feel like he didn't belong there. He says Tamar was sitting on Mendeecees' lap in the Uber. They were kissing. The intent felt clear to him. So he left. This moment becomes one of the most polarizing elements of the entire story. Supporters argue he respected boundaries. Critics argue real friends stay no matter what. But both sides agree on one thing: this decision matters. Because it establishes proximity. Funky makes it clear, repeatedly, that he was not upstairs. He removed himself. He went home. And according to him, the only people who went upstairs with Tamar that night were Mendeecees and his friend. That statement doesn't accuse, but it narrows the field. And when uncertainty narrows, speculation intensifies. When silence becomes a force, what follows isn't an explosion, it's a slow burn. Phone calls, questions, people asking why Tamar was sitting on Mendeecees' lap, why the dynamic looked the way it did, why boundaries seemed blurred in public. Then Tamar goes online. And suddenly, Funky is just someone who was there earlier. He's collateral damage. Because once a story is framed around confusion and harm, anyone connected becomes vulnerable to implication. Funky says he was pulled into conspiracies he never agreed to participate in. Labeled, discussed, assigned intent. All without his consent. And that's where his anger crystallizes into something more serious. Not embarrassment, not backlash, but exposure. The night reconstructed, decisions, locations, and the cost of ambiguity. If part 1 was about how the story fractured, part 2 is about why Funky believes it fractured in the first place. Because once the shock of the accusation settles, Funky does something that immediately separates his account from internet rumor culture. He slows everything down. He doesn't jump to conclusions. He doesn't leap to motives. Instead, he reconstructs the night step by step, not emotionally, but sequentially. And sequence matters. What Funky keeps returning to is a simple but uncomfortable idea. Chaos doesn't usually come from nowhere. It builds. It forms through decisions, through momentum, through moments where no one stops the night from going further than it should. In his telling, that night wasn't defined by confusion. It was defined by motion. Not a blur, a series of choices. Funky challenges the idea that the night was a blur by walking through how much decision-making actually occurred. They didn't stumble from one place to another without awareness. They discussed where to go. They rejected options. They changed plans. They relocated multiple times. Every shift required agreement, communication, and intention. That's what frustrates him. Because confusion implies loss of agency. But agency was present all night. They didn't just end up somewhere. They chose Roof Chris. When that phase ended, they chose to leave. When that wasn't enough, they chose another location, and then another. Funky emphasizes this not to assign blame, but to correct the narrative. When stories are told later as if events simply happened, responsibility dissolves into mystery. And mystery is exactly what the internet feeds on. The pressure to keep going. One of the quieter but more revealing parts of Funky's account is how he describes his own role as the night progressed. He says he didn't want to continue. He describes feeling pressure, not aggressive pressure, not threats, but the subtle kind that happens when plans keep changing and you don't want to be the person who stops the momentum. The kind where saying, "I'm done," feels socially disruptive. So instead of leaving, He drove himself. That detail matters. Funky wasn't being carried along without control. He was actively trying to maintain autonomy in a situation that kept extending beyond his comfort zone. Each new location felt like another step away from where he wanted to be, which was home. Sauce in Buckhead. Then V12. Each move added energy. Each move made the night less casual and more charged. And throughout all of it, Funky says the dynamic between Tamar and Mendeecees continued to feel increasingly intimate. Not hidden, not subtle, but visible enough to shift the entire atmosphere. When the night stops being yours. This is where Funky introduces a critical emotional shift. He says that at a certain point, the night stopped feeling like his plan. Not in a dramatic sense, not like control was taken from him, but like the energy no longer aligned with his presence. The group dynamic changed. The center of attention shifted. And when that happens, you either adapt or you remove yourself. Funky says he tried to remove himself. He recounts being asked to leave his car and go elsewhere, something he clearly didn't want to do. Again, not framed as coercion, but as discomfort. A moment where he realized the night was moving in a direction he didn't consent to emotionally. This is why, later, his decision not to go upstairs becomes so important. Because by the time they return to Tamar's house, Funky says he already felt like a bystander. The upstairs decision revisited. Funky revisits this moment repeatedly because he understands how it looks from the outside. To some viewers, not going upstairs feels like abandonment. To others, it feels like self-respect. But Funky frames it differently. He says he didn't go upstairs because he believed Tamar and Mendeecees wanted privacy. Not secrecy, privacy. He describes seeing Tamar sitting on Mendeecees' lap, kissing him in the Uber, and interpreting that as a clear signal. In his mind, staying would have been intrusive. So he left. He got into his car and went home. This isn't presented as heroism. It's presented as awareness. And this is where the story tightens in a way Funky likely didn't anticipate. Because once he removes himself from the physical space, he also removes himself from first-hand knowledge of what happened next. That absence becomes both his shield and his vulnerability. Absence as implication. Funky is clear about one thing. He does not know what happened upstairs. He doesn't speculate. He doesn't infer. He doesn't fill in blanks. But the internet does. Because once Tamar later frames the night publicly as one of confusion, harm, and near catastrophe, people immediately start tracing backwards. Who was there? Who was? Who left? Who stayed? And absence starts to feel like meaning. Funky says this is where everything spiraled. Because while he was not present upstairs, he was present earlier. And in the logic of social media, proximity becomes implication when stories lack precision. He describes watching this unfold in real time. Comments, messages, accusations, all rooted in the assumption that silence equals guilt. And he insists he never agreed to carry that weight. The cost of vague storytelling. What Funky keeps circling back to is how avoidable this all felt to him. He argues that if Tamar had simply clarified roles, who was present, who wasn't, what she knew versus what she didn't, the narrative wouldn't have swallowed everyone around her. Instead, Ambiguity did the work. When Tamar spoke publicly about waking up in blood and nearly dying, Funky says the gravity of those words triggered an instinctive reaction online. Find someone to blame. And because Funky had been seen with her earlier that night, suspicion attached itself to him automatically. He says that contradiction between catastrophic implication and the lack of emergency response created a vacuum where speculation thrived. No ambulance. No immediate investigation. No clear timeline. Just implication. Silence as fuel. Funky admits that at first, he stayed quiet. He believed the truth would surface on its own. He assumed clarity would eventually emerge. He didn't want to escalate anything. But instead of clarity, the narrative hardened. Silence wasn't treated as restraint. It was treated as avoidance. And as days passed, Funky says the story stopped evolving and started calcifying. Labels formed. Assumptions stuck. And by the time he decided to speak, he wasn't entering an open conversation. He was stepping into a structure already built around him. That realization changes how his anger reads. It stops sounding reactive. It starts sounding defensive, not of ego, but of identity. The central tension takes shape. By the end of this phase, the story has shifted again. It's no longer about what happened upstairs. It's about who gets to tell a story that implicates others, who gets to speak publicly while leaving others exposed, who controls the framing, and who pays the price when ambiguity is allowed to run unchecked. Funky doesn't deny that people will call him messy for speaking. He accepts that label openly. He says he'd rather be accused of being loud than quietly rewritten into a story he doesn't recognize. And with that, the conflict enters a more dangerous stage. Because now, the audience isn't just listening. They're deciding. The upstairs question: silence, proximity, and how speculation finds its target. By the time Funky reaches what everyone online now refers to as the upstairs question, the tone of the conversation has fundamentally changed. This is no longer about recounting a night out. It's about proximity. And more dangerously, it's about who can be placed closest to the unknown. Because once Funky makes it clear that he did not go upstairs and repeats it calmly and consistently, the narrative doesn't dissolve. It narrows. And narrowing is often more volatile than accusation. When the field of uncertainty shrinks, Funky understands something the internet rarely admits. Speculation doesn't need certainty. It only needs focus. Once he removes himself from the upstairs space, the number of people connected to unresolved questions drops sharply. Not because anyone has been accused, but because the story now has fewer moving parts. Funky doesn't dramatize this. He doesn't point fingers. He simply states what he knows, and just as importantly, what he doesn't. He says plainly that the only people who went upstairs with Tamar that night were Mendeecees and his friend. That statement does something powerful without sounding aggressive. It doesn't assign guilt. It doesn't imply wrongdoing. But it defines presence. And in public narratives, presence carries weight. Silence enters the story. What happens next isn't driven by new information. It's driven by silence. After Funky speaks, there is no immediate response from Tamar. No clarification, no reframing. Mendeecees remains absent as well. No statement, no denial, no explanation. And this is where the internet begins doing what it does best, not uncovering truth, but constructing meaning from absence. Comment sections shift tone. The energy changes. Conversations become quieter but heavier, less explosive, more analytical. People stop reacting emotionally and start dissecting timelines, body language, old clips. Not because they have proof, but because silence invites interpretation. Silence is never neutral online. Funky never claims that silence equals guilt. In fact, he goes out of his way to avoid that implication. But he does acknowledge its effect. He explains that in a media environment driven by attention, silence doesn't pause a story. It reshapes it. It allows others to define the narrative in your absence. And that's exactly what he says happened to him first. Before Mendeecees became the focus, Funky was. His silence was treated as suspicious. His refusal to speculate was read as evasive. His attempt to stay out of it was reframed as avoidance. That experience shapes how audiences now interpret the silence of others. Not as proof, but as pressure. The internet begins to rewatch everything. As Funky's explanation circulates, viewers don't just listen. They rewatch. Old interviews, group appearances, public outings. Subtle moments that once felt insignificant are suddenly examined under a harsher lens. Not because Funky told people to look, but because narrowing attention demands reinforcement. People begin asking quieter questions. Why did the dynamic feel so public? Why was intimacy normalized in shared spaces? Why did no one interrupt the momentum earlier? Again, no conclusions, just accumulation. This is how internet narratives harden, not through evidence, but through repetition layered on silence. Funky's restraint changes the reading. What complicates this phase even further is Funky's restraint. He refuses to speculate about what happened upstairs. He refuses to describe harm. He refuses to fill in gaps. Even when he acknowledges how bad the optics look, he stops short of drawing conclusions. Ironically, that restraint makes his account feel more credible to many viewers. Because instead of telling people what to think, he's limiting himself to what he knows firsthand. And that creates a strange dynamic where the audience feels trusted, and trusted audiences often feel empowered to decide for themselves. This is dangerous territory. Not because Funky is directing attention, but because he's stepping out of the way while the spotlight remains fixed. Presence versus responsibility. As debates intensify, a new argument takes shape. Is presence responsibility? Some viewers argue that being upstairs doesn't imply wrongdoing. Others argue that proximity to unresolved harm inevitably attracts scrutiny. Neither side claims certainty, but both sides agree on one thing. Once the story was framed around confusion and near death, the absence of clear answers made scrutiny inevitable. Funky returns to this idea repeatedly. The story didn't need villains to cause damage. It only needed ambiguity. And ambiguity, once introduced, doesn't stay contained. When silence becomes strategy or survival. As Mendeecees, silence continues, interpretations begin to split. Some viewers believe silence is legal strategy. Others believe it's professional advice. Some believe it's fear. Others believe it's confidence. None of those interpretations are confirmed, but confirmation isn't required for consequence. In entertainment culture, silence alone can destabilize reputations. It creates discomfort. It keeps questions alive longer than answers ever could. Funky seems acutely aware of this. He emphasizes again that he doesn't know what happened upstairs and refuses to speculate, even though doing so might relieve pressure from himself. That choice reframes his role once again. He doesn't sound like someone escalating a story. He sounds like someone trying to exit it alive. The weight of being left unanswered. By this stage, something subtle but important has happened. The story has stopped moving forward. There are no new revelations, no additional statements, no clarifications, and yet the tension increases. Because unanswered questions don't fade, they sink. They settle into the background of public perception, quietly shaping how people interpret future appearances, absences, and opportunities. Fans begin noticing changes, less visibility, fewer connections, subtle distancing. Whether real or coincidental, perception doesn't wait for confirmation. And this is where the narrative becomes less about facts and more about impact. The shift from event to aftermath. Funky's words now function less as testimony and more as a reference point. Viewers return to them not to extract new details, but to reinterpret intent, to reweigh tone, to reassess meaning. Some see Funky as a reluctant witness. Others see him as someone who waited too long to speak. Both interpretations coexist, and neither requires new information to survive. That's the danger of this phase. Once a story reaches this point, even silence has consequences. The uncomfortable realization. As Part 3 closes, a quiet realization settles over the audience. This story doesn't need resolution to cause damage. It only needs time. Time paired with uncertainty. Time paired with silence. Time paired with public attention. Whatever happened upstairs may never be fully known. But the impact of how the story was framed, and who was left exposed by that framing, is already being felt. By the time this story reaches its fourth phase, something important has changed. The internet is no longer asking what happened. It's asking who controlled the story. Because once Funky finishes laying out his version, the conversation stops being driven by events and starts being driven by framing. Not facts alone, but how those facts and uncertainties were presented to the public. And in modern media, framing is power. When stories stop being about truth and start being about shape. Funky returns again and again to one idea. This situation escalated not because of what was said, but because of how it was said. He doesn't argue that Tamar should have stayed silent. He argues that when someone goes public with a story involving harm, especially harm wrapped in uncertainty, they take on responsibility for the consequences of that framing. Because the internet does not handle ambiguity gently. Ambiguity invites participation. It invites interpretation. It invites strangers to fill in gaps that were never clearly defined. And once that happens, control is lost. Funky suggests that this wasn't an accident, not necessarily malicious, but familiar. He describes a pattern he says he's seen before. Moments where just enough is said to spark attention, followed by withdrawal before clarity arrives. Statements loud enough to provoke reaction, but vague enough to avoid accountability. He doesn't claim intent. He claims repetition. And repetition is what causes audiences to start reassessing earlier assumptions. Consent in public storytelling. This is where Funky's frustration sharpens into something more principled. He talks about consent. Not consent in a legal sense, but narrative consent. The idea that no one should be pulled into a public storm without agreeing to be there. That involving others in a story of harm without nomming roles or clarifying boundaries exposes them to suspicion they didn't choose. Funky insists that he never agreed to be part of the story. He didn't agree to be analyzed. He didn't agree to be implicated. He didn't agree to become a character in a narrative that implied wrongdoing without stating it directly. And when that happens, silence isn't protection, it's vulnerability. How ambiguity turns into entertainment. As the story spreads, Funky describes watching ambiguity turn into content. Clips chopped out of context. Reactions layered on reactions. Speculation framed as analysis. He explains that once a narrative enters this phase, it no longer belongs to the people involved. It belongs to algorithms. What gets amplified isn't clarity, it's tension. What spreads fastest isn't truth, it's uncertainty. And once that machine starts moving, it doesn't require new information to keep going. It feeds on repetition alone. Funky says this is where he realized staying silent wasn't neutral anymore. Choosing damage over silence. One of the most revealing moments in Funky's account is when he openly accepts how speaking will make him look. He says people can paint him as messy, and he'll accept it. That admission changes how audiences interpret everything that came before it. It no longer sounds like someone trying to protect an image. It sounds like someone choosing between two kinds of harm and picking the one he can live with. Silence would have kept him safer temporarily, but it would have allowed the narrative to continue hardening around him. Speaking risks backlash, but it reasserts agency. In that moment, Funky reframes himself not as someone escalating drama, but as someone refusing to be quietly rewritten. The internet's reaction evolves. As this framing spreads, the audience response shifts again. The outrage cools, the shouting fades. What replaces it is something quieter and more dangerous: interpretation. Viewers begin debating not just what happened, but how stories should be told. Whether Tamar's approach was reckless or understandable. Whether Funky waited too long or spoke at the only moment left. And crucially, whether silence from others is protecting them or exposing them further. This is where the focus drifts again. Away from Funky. Away from Tamar. And back toward Mendeecees. The weight of being unspoken. Funky doesn't accuse Mendeecees of anything. He repeats that he doesn't know what happened upstairs and refuses to speculate. But he acknowledges how this looks. He understands that when one person speaks clearly and another remains silent, audiences naturally compare, not to assign guilt, but to evaluate credibility. Silence becomes the loudest element in the room. And in this environment, silence doesn't read as neutrality. It reads as strategy, fear, advice, or calculation, depending on who's interpreting it. None of those interpretations are confirmed. But perception doesn't wait for confirmation. Momentum without direction. By this stage, the story has developed its own inertia. There are no new facts, no official statements, no interventions, and yet the sense of consequence grows. Fans begin noticing patterns, absences, distancing, changes in visibility. Whether coincidence or correlation, the perception alone begins shaping reputations. This is the part of public controversies that rarely gets acknowledged. Damage doesn't always arrive as scandal. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through hesitation, lost opportunities, subtle shifts in how people are treated. Funky seems painfully aware of this. He explains that the worst part isn't the noise. It's watching narratives settle into place while no one interrupts them. The story stops moving and starts settling. By the end of this phase, something critical has happened. The story is no longer unfolding. It's settling, like sediment sinking to the bottom, shaping the landscape beneath the surface of public perception. And once that sediment hardens, it becomes very difficult to disturb. This is why Funky keeps returning to the same points, not to convince everyone, but to leave a record, something stable that resists distortion over time. He doesn't demand belief. He demands boundaries. And in doing so, he exposes the most unsettling truth of this entire saga. In modern media, stories don't need conclusions to create outcomes. They only need time, attention, and silence. By the time this story reaches its fifth phase, something subtle but profound has taken hold. There are no new revelations, no dramatic reversals, no sudden statements that tie everything together. And yet the impact deepens. Because the most lasting consequences of public controversies rarely arrive with headlines. They arrive quietly, through shifts in perception, altered relationships, and opportunities that simply stop coming. This is the phase where damage doesn't announce itself. It settles. When the internet stops asking and starts assuming. At first, the conversation was loud, emotional, reactive. But now the tone has changed. People aren't flooding comment sections demanding answers anymore. They're quietly forming opinions. And once opinions form, they tend to stick, even without confirmation. This is what makes unresolved stories so powerful. They allow audiences to complete the narrative themselves. And the versions people build in their heads don't require proof. They only require coherence, a story that feels like it explains what they've already seen. Funky seems acutely aware of this. He explains that what worries him most isn't being attacked directly. It's being quietly categorized. Because once someone is categorized as suspicious, unreliable, problematic, or risky, the consequences don't need to be spoken out loud. They simply unfold. Reputation damage without accusation. One of the most uncomfortable realities Funky points to is how reputational harm can occur without anyone ever making a direct accusation. No one has to say, "You did something wrong." All it takes is proximity to unresolved harm. All it takes is silence that leaves room for interpretation. All it takes is enough ambiguity that people start making risk calculations in their own heads. This is especially true in entertainment and media spaces, where perception often matters as much as reality, and sometimes more. Funky suggests that by the time he spoke publicly, some of that damage had already occurred. Not visibly, not dramatically, but quietly. Phone calls that didn't come back. Invitations that stopped arriving. A subtle shift in how people interacted with him. None of it provable, all of it felt. The Mendeecees question becomes a shadow. As Funky's role becomes clearer in the public mind, or at least more defined, attention doesn't disappear. It moves. Without accusation, without confirmation, Mendeecees becomes a shadow in the narrative. Not because Funky points to him aggressively, but because unresolved stories always look for somewhere to rest. Silence becomes the defining characteristic. And silence, whether fair or not, carries meaning. Funky doesn't claim to know why Mendeecees hasn't spoken. He avoids assigning motive, but he acknowledges the effect. In a story shaped by ambiguity, the absence of voice becomes a kind of presence. Not evidence, not guilt, but pressure, love and hip-hop, and the perception of distance. Around this time, fans begin noticing something else. Subtle changes, appearances that feel less frequent, connections that seem weaker, no announcement, no explanation, just absence. Again, nothing confirmed, nothing official. But in entertainment culture, silence paired with absence is rarely interpreted as coincidence. Funky doesn't assert causation. He doesn't claim behind-the-scenes consequences, but he acknowledges how patterns are read once a narrative has formed. People start asking not if there's fallout, but where it's happening. And the truth is, fallout doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like distance. How silence becomes permanent. What makes this phase particularly heavy is the realization that the story may never fully resolve. No final statement. No definitive timeline. No authoritative conclusion. And over time, the absence of resolution becomes permanent. This is how reputations change without a single headline declaring it. This is how stories fade, but leave residue. Funky seems resigned to this reality. He doesn't sound hopeful that speaking will fix everything. He sounds like someone who understands that at this point, the best he can do is define his own boundaries. He can't control how others are perceived. He can't control how silence is interpreted. He can only refuse to carry a narrative that isn't his. The emotional cost of being misunderstood. One of the quieter but more revealing elements of Funky's account is the emotional toll. Not outrage, not humiliation, but disappointment. He describes feeling hurt not by blogs or strangers, but by the idea that someone he considered a real friend allowed the story to unfold in a way that made him look complicit in something he says he never witnessed and never participated in. He emphasizes that he didn't need anything from Tamar. No attention, no benefit, no leverage. Which is why the framing stung. Not because it embarrassed him, but because it suggested a betrayal of trust. When stories outgrow their origin. At this stage, the story no longer belongs to the people involved. It belongs to the internet. It's shaped by repetition, silence, and emotional inference. It exists less as an event and more as an atmosphere, something that hovers over names, associations, and future interactions. And that's what makes it so difficult to escape. Because even if no one speaks again, the story continues, quietly influencing how people interpret everything that comes next. Funky seems to accept this with a kind of exhaustion. He doesn't posture as someone trying to win the narrative. He sounds like someone trying to survive it. The most unsettling truth. As Part 5 closes, one realization becomes unavoidable. This story didn't need confirmation to cause damage. It didn't need accusations to alter reputations. It didn't need resolution to leave a mark. All it needed was time and silence. And by now, both have done their work. The moral center of the story, responsibility, collateral damage, and who pays the price. By the time Funky reaches what feels like the end of his emotional runway, the story is no longer about timelines, locations, or even silence. It's about responsibility. Not legal responsibility. Not criminal responsibility. But narrative responsibility. Who bears it, who avoids it, and who ends up paying the price when it's mishandled. This is where Funky's frustration turns reflective. When damage isn't the goal, but but still happens. Funky makes something clear that reframes everything once again. He says he doesn't believe Tamar set out to destroy anyone. That distinction matters, because what he's describing isn't malice, it's carelessness. The kind that happens when emotion meets an audience too quickly, when personal pain is released publicly before its ripple effects are fully considered. Funky argues that harm doesn't require bad intent. It only requires imbalance. One person speaks, others don't. And suddenly, power shifts. The difference between telling your story and creating one. One of Funky's most important points comes down to a single difference: telling your story versus creating a story. He suggests that when Tamar spoke publicly, the story wasn't just shared, it was shaped. Certain elements were emphasized, others were left vague. The result wasn't clarity, but emotional direction. Viewers were told how to feel before they were told what happened. And when emotion leads, logic struggles to catch up. Funky doesn't accuse Tamar of lying about pain. He accuses her of presenting uncertainty as innocence while still guiding public reaction. That's the distinction he keeps returning to. Not harm versus no harm, but clarity versus implication. The moment he names the real casualty, then Funky says something that lands harder than any accusation. He says the only person truly done wrong in this situation was Yandy. The room changes. Because up until now, the story has revolved around speculation, proximity, and silence. But this statement pulls the lens outward. It reminds the audience that beyond narratives and fallout, there are real people whose lives were disrupted without their consent. People who didn't speak. People who didn't imply. People who were still affected. This moment grounds the entire saga. It forces a recalibration of sympathy. Collateral damage is still damage. Funky explains that collateral damage doesn't hurt less, just because it wasn't intended. Yandy didn't ask to be part of this story. She didn't shape the narrative. She didn't speak publicly. And yet, she absorbed the impact. This is where Funky's argument becomes broader than any one individual. He suggests that in public storytelling, the responsibility isn't just to yourself, it's to everyone your story touches. Because once something goes public, it stops being personal. It becomes communal. Why he finally drew the line. Funky admits that speaking came with a cost he was fully aware of. He knew people would accuse him of being dramatic. He knew others would say he waited too long. He knew some would say he should have stayed quiet. And he accepted all of that. What he couldn't accept was being permanently written into a story he didn't recognize, one that implied wrongdoing through silence rather than evidence. This is where his decision stops feeling reactive and starts feeling inevitable. He wasn't trying to control the narrative. He was trying to exit it with his integrity intact. Silence as a weapon, even when unintentional. One of the most unsettling insights Funky offers is how silence can become a weapon, even when it isn't meant to be. When one person speaks and others don't, silence becomes a canvas. People project motives onto it. Fear, strategy, guilt, advice from lawyers, pressure from networks. None of it needs to be true to have an effect. Funky argues that this dynamic punishes restraint and rewards implication. And once that system takes hold, there are no clean choices left. The exhaustion beneath the anger. As Funky's tone softens, something else becomes clear. This isn't anger anymore. It's exhaustion. He sounds like someone who has accepted that the story may never resolve, and that resolution might not even matter anymore. Because the consequences are already embedded. Reputations have shifted. Trust has been strained. Silence has spoken louder than words ever could. And no final statement will undo that. The question that lingers. As Part 6 closes, the audience is left with a question that goes beyond this situation. In a culture where stories move faster than facts, what is the ethical way to speak publicly about harm? Is it better to speak too soon, or not at all? Is silence protection or exposure? And when narratives involve others, who owes clarity to whom? Funky doesn't answer these questions. He simply exposes them. When silence speaks louder than truth. By the time this story reaches its final stretch, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. This was never just about what happened that night. It was about how the story moved afterward. Because whatever the truth is, and it may never be fully known, the consequences were not driven by facts alone. They were driven by framing, by timing, and by silence. Funky didn't come forward to win sympathy. He didn't come forward to dominate the narrative. He came forward because the narrative had already started to consume him without his consent. And that distinction matters. In his telling, the deepest violation wasn't embarrassment or backlash. It was exposure. Being placed inside a public story of harm without clarity, without permission, and without the chance to define his own role. That's the uncomfortable reality of modern media. Stories don't need conclusions to create outcomes. They only need momentum. Once a narrative is framed around confusion and near catastrophe, the internet will do what it always does: assign meaning, identify proximity, and search for someone to carry the weight. And when silence fills the gaps, perception rushes in. This is why this situation feels heavier than typical celebrity controversy. Not because of what was proven, but because of what was left unresolved. Because ambiguity doesn't stay neutral. It settles into reputations. It shapes relationships. It quietly alters futures. Funky understood that staying silent wouldn't protect him. It would only allow others to define him. So he chose the more dangerous option, speaking. Not loudly. Not recklessly. But deliberately. He accepted the labels. Messy, dramatic, too late. He accepted them because the alternative was erasure. Being written into a story that implied wrongdoing without ever stating it outright. And yet, perhaps the most important moment of all came when Funky reframed the focus away from himself. When he said the person most wronged in this situation wasn't him. Wasn't Tamar. But Yandy. That single statement cut through all the noise. It reminded everyone watching that narratives don't just affect the people telling them. They affect everyone connected, especially those who didn't speak, didn't imply, and didn't consent. That's the moral center of this story. Not guilt, not innocence, but responsibility. Responsibility to be precise. Responsibility to understand how implication travels. Responsibility to recognize that silence doesn't stop stories, it reshapes them. So now, the conversation belongs to you. Not in the form of rumors, not guesses, not theories, but interpretation. Who do you believe handled this situation the worst, speaking too much, or not speaking at all? Did Funky cross a line by finally telling his side? Or was he reacting to pressure that had already spun out of control? Did Tamar's silence protect her, or did it leave too much space for perception to grow unchecked? And when it comes to Mendeecees, does staying quiet in moments like this help, or does it quietly make things worse? Drop your thoughts in the comments, but keep it grounded. This story deserves discussion, not distortion. If this breakdown helped you see beyond the headlines and understand why this situation feels different, like the video, it helps push deeper analysis instead of noise. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want more conversations like this, where we slow down, respect complexity, and resist easy answers. Because stories like this don't usually end with a statement. They end when silence breaks. And when it does, it rarely sounds the way anyone expects. Stay critical, stay thoughtful, and we'll be here when the next chapter arrives.